Hello, and welcome to Cause of Death, 100 Seconds to Midnight. I'm your host, Jackie Moranti. I've worked in research for 16 years in various capacities. If there's one thing I know about, it's infectious disease. And I think all of you should know about it too. It's important that people have a basic understanding of the diseases that affect people, animals, and the environment. I bring these stories to you through the lens of history, education, and my personal experiences in the lab. With that, I want to start with a listener letter. I love listener letters. Mary sent me an email with a news article attached. The article said that 47% of people don't think that life will ever get back to normal after the COVID-19 pandemic. If you listen to the smallpox episodes, the Spanish flu episode, and the polio episode, many of the same things happened that happened during the COVID pandemic. Schools were shut down, social distancing was a thing, people wore masks, they were encouraged to stay home, there was grocery delivery, there were vaccine mandates, and there were travel cards. People had to prove that they were vaccinated before they could travel. During the polio epidemic, no one could leave New York City without proof that they had been vaccinated. As I sit here today, the COVID-19 pandemic has had relatively little long-term effect on people. We're no longer wearing masks or social distancing. I haven't had to show my vaccination card in ages. What it comes down to is this. People, as a rule, are extremely short-sighted. They don't see past next week or maybe next month. They think everything is going to last forever, especially if that thing is something they view as negative. In truth, very few policies surrounding healthcare crises remain permanent. Our society is more concerned with war than public health. This is why 9/11 caused way more changes to society than COVID-19 ever will. At the end of the day, we're far more concerned about the cost of rebuilding infrastructure than we are with any sort of human destruction, even though human destruction is priceless. Thank you, Mary, for sending that in. It was a great article, and maybe there will be an episode on that subject. It's something else to add to my list. Now that I've given you that bit of insight, let's get on to today's subject. Botulism. This is the last disease in the Restaurant Rogues season. I'll have one more episode in Season 5 on the difference between food poisoning and food toxicity. Then we'll move on to what I think will be my favorite season. Season 6 will be all about wildlife diseases. It's going to be a rather long season with 4 wildlife diseases and at least 3 100 Seconds to Midnight episodes, all about how the clock is ticking for wildlife as well as people. We're all connected, my friends, so if one of us goes down, we all go down. That season is going to be called Who's Who Outside of the Zoo. Okay, let's begin where we always begin, with etiology and pathology. Botulism is caused by a gram-positive anaerobic spore-forming rod in the family Clostridium botulinum. While it can also be caused by C. barattii or C. butyricum, these are very rare instances. These organisms form spores that are ubiquitous in the environment and are capable of surviving indefinitely through most naturally occurring conditions, as well as boiling and other routine cooking practices. People routinely eat botulism spores, but they rarely become ill. It's only when the spores germinate that the toxin can become dangerous or even fatal. The circumstances have to be just right for the spores to germinate, and the confluence of these events are very, very rare. The conditions have to be anaerobic, pH must be lower than 4.5, there must be a low salt and sugar content, and temperatures must range between 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 Celsius and 99 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And even that depends on the serotype of the toxin. The precise lethal dose for botulinum remains unknown, but these toxins are the most potent biologic toxins known to man. To give a bit of an idea of what we're dealing with here, lethal doses for purified crystalline botulinum toxin type A in a 154-pound man are estimated to be roughly 70 micrograms when induced orally. If the toxin is inhaled, the dose drops significantly to anywhere between 0.80 and 0.90 micrograms. Again, this isn't something we know for sure, it's just an estimate, but that's not a lot of toxin to make someone die. There are 7 antigenically distinct botulinum toxins: A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Most strains produce a single toxin, but there have been strains identified that produce 2 toxins. Type A is the most potent toxin, followed by types B and F. Types A, B, and E are usually associated with systemic botulism in humans. Types C, D, and E cause illness in other mammals, birds, and fish. All botulinum toxins have similar structures. They consist of a zinc endopeptidase protein formed by a heavy chain of approximately 100,000 Daltons and a light chain of approximately 50,000 Daltons. These are linked by a disulfide bond. All serotypes interfere with neurotransmission by blocking the release of acetylcholine, which is the main neurotransmitter at the neuromuscular junction. Intramuscular administration of botulinum toxin acts at the neuromuscular junction to cause muscle paralysis by inhibiting the release of acetylcholine from presynaptic motor neurons. Botulinum toxins act at 4 sites in the body: the neuromuscular junction, the autonomic ganglia, postganglionic parasympathetic nerve endings, and postganglionic sympathetic nerve endings that release acetylcholine. The heavy chain of the toxin binds selectively and irreversibly to high-affinity receptors at the presynaptic surface of cholinergic neurons, and the toxin receptor complex is taken up into the cell by endocytosis. The disulfide bond between the 2 chains is cleaved and the toxin escapes into the cytoplasm. The light chain interacts with different proteins in the nerve terminals to prevent fusion of acetylcholine vesicles with the cell membrane. There are several different kinds of botulism: foodborne, wound, infant, adult intestinal colonization, inhalation, and injection. About 110 cases of botulism are reported in the U.S. each year. Of these, approximately 25% are foodborne, 72% are infant botulism, and the rest are wound botulism. Foodborne botulism is very serious and potentially fatal. However, it's relatively rare. It's considered a food intoxication that's usually caused by ingestion of neurotoxins that have formed in contaminated food. Symptoms of foodborne botulism begin with marked fatigue, weakness and vertigo, usually followed by blurred vision, dried mouth, and difficulty swallowing and speaking. Vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, and abdominal swelling may also occur. As the disease progresses, there will be weakness in the neck and arms. Then the respiratory muscles and the muscles of the lower body will begin to weaken. Finally, there can be descending flaccid paralysis that can cause respiratory failure. There will be no fever or loss of consciousness. Symptoms will usually appear within 24 to 36 hours after exposure. This disease is fatal in 5 to 10% of cases. Immediate diagnosis and care are paramount to survival. Botulinum toxin has been found in a variety of foods, including low-acid preserved vegetables, such as green beans, spinach, mushrooms, and beets, fish, including canned tuna, fermented, salted, and smoked fish, and meat products such as ham and sausage. The big thing is home canning. Most botulism cases come from improperly canned foods. Infant botulism occurs mostly in infants under 6 months of age. This occurs when infants ingest the spores, which germinate into bacteria that colonize the gut and release toxins. Because children under 6 months of age have developing immune systems, they are more susceptible to botulinum toxin. Symptoms include constipation, loss of appetite, weakness, an altered cry, and a loss of head control. There are several sources of infant botulism, but the most common is honey. In recent years, it has been suggested that parents shouldn't feed honey to their children before they turn a year old. Wound botulism occurs when the spores get into an open wound and are able to reproduce. Symptoms are similar to foodborne botulism and may take up to 2 weeks to appear. This form of botulism has been associated with drug abuse, particularly when injecting black tar heroin. So just don't do that. Ever. Inhalation botulism does not occur naturally. You're not going to get it from sniffing flowers. This form is associated with accidental or intentional events, which result in the release of the toxins in aerosols. This can include acts of bioterrorism. Botulism is on the list of potential bioterrorism sources. The median lethal dose for people has been estimated at 2 nanograms of botulinum toxin per kilogram of body weight. This is about 3 times less than the doses for food botulism. The symptoms are the same for inhalation botulism as they are for food botulism. Symptoms appear about 1 to 3 days after exposure and proceed along the same path as foodborne intoxication, eventually ending with respiratory failure and muscle paralysis. If inhalation exposure is suspected, additional exposure to others must be prevented. The patient's clothing must be removed immediately and stored in plastic bags until they can be washed thoroughly in soap and water. The patient should shower and be decontaminated immediately. Botulism is often misdiagnosed as stroke, Guillain-Barré syndrome, or myasthenia gravis. Antitoxin should be administered as soon as possible after diagnosis. The earlier this is treated, the better the prognosis. Severe cases will include supportive treatment, including mechanical ventilation, which may be required long-term. There is a vaccine, but it is rarely used because the efficacy has not been proven and it has some very severe side effects. Botulinum toxin has been used for a variety of medical conditions. People have been using it cosmetically since the late 80s, but it's been prescribed for a variety of medical conditions as well. It has been approved for use in certain cases of overactive bladder, treatment of incontinence, neurogenic detrusor overactivity, chronic migraines, muscle spasms, cervical dystoria, axillary hyperhidrosis, strabismus, and disorders of the 7th cranial nerve. Off-label uses include TMJ disorders, myofascial pain, neurogenic thoracic outlet syndrome, epicondylitis, post-stroke pain, post-herpetic neuralgia, diabetic neuropathy, trigeminal neuralgia, neuropathic pain, spinal cord injury, and bladder pain. Since botulinum toxin is an acetylcholine inhibitor, it does reduce muscle contraction and spasm. Cosmetically, the paralysis of facial muscles temporarily treats wrinkles. Let's face it, folks, you're going to get older, and unless you want to totally paralyze your face, it's going to wrinkle. Contraindications are pretty severe. Muscles can permanently atrophy. Axonal sprouting may begin, and extrajunctional acetylcholine receptors can be formed. Reinnervation may also occur, which will reverse the effects of the toxin. If toxicity occurs, the patient will experience neuromuscular weakness, dysphagia, dysphonia, weakness, dyspnea, or respiratory distress. In recent years, there have been several incidences of adverse effects on people who have received Botox treatments by unlicensed estheticians. Some of these instances have had irreversible consequences. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, then come back with some history. Foodborne botulism has probably been around since the dawn of mankind. The ways that people stored food were perfect for growing C. botulinum, ham stored in barrels of brine, poorly dried and stored herring, trout packed to ferment in willow baskets, sturgeon roe not yet salted and piled on heaps of horse hides, lightly smoked fish or ham in poorly heated smoking chambers. Then, of course, there are insufficiently boiled blood sausages. There have been ancient dietary laws that could reflect botulism toxicity going back to the 10th century, when Emperor Leo VI of Byzantium banned the manufacture of blood sausage. There have also been some ancient case reports of Atropa belladonna intoxication that parallel foodborne botulism. But the combination of dilated pupils and fatal muscle paralysis can't be attributed to belladonna poisoning. There was a time when shamans would suggest adding just a touch of botulism to the plate of a guest that the Maharajas would rather see dead. The shamans even had a recipe for such a thing. They would take a bit of the powder extracted from blood sausages. This powder would be dried under anaerobic conditions and added to the enemy's food at a banquet. Death would occur days after said enemy ingested the fatal dose, so no one would be the wiser. In 1793, 13 people were involved in the first well-recorded botulism outbreak in the small German town of Wildbad. 6 of these people died. At first blush, it was believed that all 13 had suffered from atropine poisoning. But, as scientists tend to do, they argued over it, and the term sausage poison started getting thrown around. The medical experts of the time blamed Blunzen, which was a popular local food made from cooked pork stomach filled with blood and spices. I'll pass, thanks. By the end of the 1700s, the instances of botulism increased dramatically due to the poverty caused by the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, when there is a critical event that causes people to lose everything they have, infrastructure gets lost also. Sanitary measures began to decline in rural food production. In July of 1802, the royal government of Württemberg in Stuttgart issued a public warning about the consumption of smoked blood sausages. These outbreaks prompted early research in the cause of the disease. It also prompted the royal government to ban the production of blood sausage for a while. In August of 1811, the medical section of the Department of Internal Affairs of the Kingdom of Württemberg at Stuttgart again began studying the sausage poisoning problem. At this point, they thought it had something to do with hydrocyanic acid, also known as prussic acid. The members of the medical faculty of the University of Tübingen disputed that prussic acid could be the culprit. They put the idea forth that this had to be caused by some biological agent. Johann Heinrich Ferdinand Autenreith was a professor at the University of Tübingen. He asked the government to collect the reports of doctors and health officers on cases of food poisoning for scientific analysis. Data, data, data. I cannot make bricks without clay. After Autenreith studied the reports, he compiled a list of symptoms of sausage poisoning. This list was issued to health officials with the comment that he blamed housewives for the poisoning because they didn't soak the sausages long enough in boiling water. In 1815, a health officer in the village of Harenburg J.G. Steinberg sent reports of 7 patients who had gotten botulism from eating liver sausage and peas. 3 of the patients had died. So much for soaking blood sausages in boiling water. Justinus Kerner, who was oddly enough a medical officer and a romantic poet, I guess that at least one of those professions would make a decent living, reported a lethal food poisoning from the small village that he was living in at the time. Artenreith took the reports of Steinbuch and Kerner into consideration and published both of them in a medical journal called Tübinger Papers for Natural Sciences in 1817. Kerner also suspected a biological agent as the cause of food poisoning by sausage. He continued to look into the events, and after observing a few more cases, he wrote a paper in 1820 called New Observations on the Lethal Poisoning that Occurs so Frequently in Württemberg Owing to the Consumption of Smoked Sausages, in which he summarized the case histories of 76 patients and gave a complete clinical description of what we now call botulism. Kerner compared various recipes and ingredients of the sausages that his 76 case studies had consumed. He found that the recipes differed in the type of meats, blood, liver, brain, fat, salt, pepper, coriander, pimento, ginger, and bread. The only common ingredients were fat and salt. He ruled out salt and concluded that it had to have something to do with the fat. He later speculated about the connections between what he was now calling fat poison and other known poisons such as atropine, scopolamine, nicotine, and snake venom. Somehow he came to the conclusion that fat poison was a biological poison rather than an acid or other poison. In 1822, he published another paper that included 155 case reports, including post-mortem studies of patients with botulism. He put forth the hypothesis that, quote, the fat poison, or the fatty acid, and its effects on the animal body system, a contribution to the examination of the substance responsible for the toxicity of bad sausages, end quote. He gave a very accurate description of the muscle symptoms and clinical details of the entire range of autonomic disturbances that had occurred in the patients that he had observed. These included mydriasis, decrease of lacrimation and secretion from the salivary glands, and gastrointestinal and bladder paralysis. He experimented on various species of animals by feeding them the extracts of bad sausages, and finally he began to experiment on himself. He found from clinical symptoms that he experienced that the toxin could interrupt the motor and autonomic nervous signal transmission. His conclusions were, quote, the nerve conduction is brought by the toxin to a condition in which its influence on the chemical processes of life is interrupted. The capacity of nerve conduction is interrupted by the toxin in the same way as in electrical conductor by rust, end quote. He also listed his findings as 1. That the toxin develops in bad sausages under anaerobic conditions. 2. That the toxin acts on the motor nerves and the autonomic nervous system. And 3. That the toxin is strong and lethal even in small doses. He also postulated that the toxin could be used as a therapeutic agent in cases of, quote, hyperexcitability of the nervous system, end quote. He mostly leaned toward treating psychological disorders, but who knew that almost 300 years later, we would be using botulinum toxin as a cure for several physical disorders. On December 14th of 1895, a botulism outbreak after a funeral dinner in the small Belgian village of Ezels led to a breakthrough in research. 34 people who had attended the lavish funeral celebration of 87-year-old Antoine Créateur were struck down by botulism after they ate smoked ham. This led to the discovery of the pathogen by Emile Pierre van Ermegem, professor of bacteriology at the University of Ghent. Van Ermegem had worked with Robert Koch in Berlin in 1883, and this taught him a thing or two. He isolated the bacterium from the ham and the bodies of the victims. He grew it, and he began experimenting on various species of animals. He described the toxin itself and called it Bacillus botulinus. Botulus is the Latin word for sausage. His observations were published in the Journal of Hygiene and Infectious Disease in 1897. His paper concluded that sausage poisoning was caused by an anaerobic microorganism produced during the salting process. He put forth his findings as 1. Botulism is an intoxication, not an infection. 2. The toxin is produced in food by a bacterium. 3. The toxin is not produced if the salt concentration in the food is high. 4. After ingestion, the toxin is not activated by the normal digestive process. 5. The toxin is susceptible to inactivation by heat. And 6. Not all species of animals are equally susceptible. These findings would springboard further research into the causes and effects of botulism for years to come. In 1904, an outbreak of botulism occurred after several people in the city of Darmstadt, Germany, consumed white beans. This led to the realization that there was more than one serotype of botulism. The present letter designations would be assigned in 1919 by Georgina Burke. Commercial canning processes would change after an outbreak of botulism occurred in 1906. Commercially canned pork and beans was the culprit in that instance. And it would spur food manufacturers to lower the pH to below 4, and heating requirements would change to prevent the toxin from growing. Type C would be found in 1922 by Bankston in the U.S. and in Australia by Seddon. Type D would be discovered in the U.S. by Meyer and Gunnison, and Type E would be found in Ukraine in 1936 by Bier. Type F was identified in Scandinavia by Moller and Scheibel in 1960, and finally, Type G was discovered in 1970 in Argentina by Gimex and Ciccarelli. In 1949, Burgeon and his colleagues found that botulinum toxin blocked the release of acetylcholine neuromuscular junctions. Therapeutic research began in the 1970s and has continued ever since. I'm going to add an episode on bacteria as therapeutic agents in my never-ending list of things to talk about, but it may be a while before I get to it. For now, that's botulism. Next time, I'll talk about the differences between food poisoning and food intoxication. And that will wrap up Season 5 on the Restaurant Rogues. The beginning of Season 6 will kick off with my Podversary episode. I've been at this for 2 years, and I've got a very special episode coming up that I hope will spark some conversation and debate on my socials. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at jackie@causeofdeath100sex.net or leave a message on my website at www.causeofdeath100sex.net. Please check the show notes for all of my social media platforms and ways that you can get involved with my Facebook page, my Facebook group, my Twitter feed, and my TikTok. There are several ways to support the show. You can leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening now. And most importantly, you can share this podcast with everyone you know. If you'd like to support the show monetarily, please check out my Patreon page or subscribe on Apple subscriptions. And don't forget to support my sponsors. Don't forget to check the show notes for links to all my amazing sponsors and the discount codes. Thank you all for listening, and special thanks to all that have subscribed on Apple subscriptions. I can't call you out by name, unfortunately, but you know who you are. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, keep the pH of your sausage below 4. And I'll see you in 2 weeks.